Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm an alcoholic. What a great audience, thank you. Um, okay. Guild Wars 2. So I have a lot of playtime in MMOs, and I do mean a lot of playtime. At this point, I feel like I've tried just about every MMO flavor out there, and I figured out what I like and what I don't like about this type of game. For example, I found out that I really like the feeling of progression you get from these types of games. As you put in the hours, watch your character grow stronger and stronger, and your number get bigger and bigger. Nice. I also found out that I really don't like when the developers decide to just let you skip all that by paying a buttload of real-life cash for a boost, the strongest gear, or getting that same progression I talked about behind some really tedious and extremely time-consuming RNG bullshit.
Boom, bell. Boom, bell. Boom, bell.
World of Warcraft was my first taste of the MMO genre back in vanilla days, but it's definitely not my favorite MMO today. No, that title goes to a little game called, you guessed it, Final Fantasy XIV, baby! So I know this might sound weird given the title of this video, but Final Fantasy XIV is a game that's incredibly special to me. It's definitely the MMO I have the most fond memories of, and that's for a good reason. It's here I met this crazy group of degenerates called Eternal Dawn, who I've since become really good friends with and I've hung out with in real life. We still hang out a lot in Discord and we still return to Final Fantasy XIV whenever a new patch or expansion comes around. So that does of course give me a strong sense of attachment to Final Fantasy XIV. But if we talk about the merits of the game itself, I would say that 14 offers some really strong storytelling, as well as some really interesting and well thought out encounter design when it comes to the trials and raid encounters in the game. Much can be said about the way the game delivers the story, which is mostly just cutscene after cutscene after cutscene, but the actual stories themselves are really great in my opinion, with Shadowbringers and Endwalker being some of my most treasured stories in any game ever. There's just a level of writing and understanding of characters here that can't be found anywhere else in the MMO or even the RPG space, in my opinion. As such, these stories are just really emotionally charged and resonant, especially if you're a fan like me.
Such devastation! This was not my intention!
The other central draw to Final Fantasy XIV is the encounter design, specifically the 8-man trial and raids in the game. They're very well put together in my opinion. Every fight is kind of like its own little web of mechanics that players need to untangle as they go along. And the mechanics can actually differ depending on whether you're playing a tank, healer, or DPS, and so every role kind of has their own unique job to play, no pun intended. And on extreme and savage difficulties, which are basically the end game versions, the harder difficulties of the raids, just one person messing up can actually kill the entire team.
Everyone hears you then?
Yeah, you're right. No, I turned.
And while on paper this might not sound very fun, it actually means that every person in that 8-man team has an important role to play and is integral to making sure that the team succeeds. And so every person actually feels like they contributed at the end when they clear the fight. And when you come out the other end of a savage raid in 14, so to speak, you feel like you've mastered this deadly dance of some sort, like you've mastered this new skill with your team. And so I cannot praise this type of content enough. Like, it's some of the content in 14 I've spent the most hours on. It's just mastering these fights. But, you might be thinking, what does all this have to do with Guild Wars 2? Believe it or not, this is still a Guild Wars 2 video. Yes, it says so in the title, right? So it's gotta be a Guild Wars 2 video, and it is. It's coming. The reason I had to tell you all this is just because I've been trying to figure out what in the world I am doing, playing and enjoying Guild Wars 2 so much, when these are the sorts of things that I really like in an MMO, apparently. Because I gotta tell you, Guild Wars 2 does not do either of these things nearly as well, in my opinion. Now, before the whole of the Guild Wars 2 fanbase descends upon me like a pack of rabid char, I just gotta tell you, I don't think the encounter design or the story is bad by any means. I just feel like I've set a bar that's really high for myself by playing 14 as much as I have. I like to compare the story of Guild Wars 2 and its expansions to that of the Marvel Cinematic Universe back in 2018. Very important to point out. The stories told are fine, but more importantly, they really get you hyped up for some big action-packed moments. The stories also feature the same ragtag bunch of characters that the player gets to watch and follow as they develop throughout the expansions, and for the most part this is done really well and feels satisfying. Something I do really like about the storytelling, and something that's kind of unique to Guild Wars 2, is that the player character, the commander or the wayfinder as they're called later in the game, actually speaks their mind in many cases without the player's input.
Alice, Anise. Heck of a party.
Now, some people might not like that the player character speaks their own mind and is kind of free of player control in that way, but I gotta admit, I really liked it in many cases in Guild Wars. Speaking of talking, or talking of speaking, the story does have these moments where it gets like really talky, and it does have a tendency to drag these out for just a bit too long, so it grinds down the pace to a halt. In the newest expansion alone, there are 2 whole council scenes where you just go to an embassy, you stand at the podium, and then you just listen to characters talk for what feels like minutes and minutes on end. It's really a shame because I actually do find the world building and the lore behind Guild Wars and Guild Wars 2 really interesting, and I think Living World Season 4 does in particular a spectacular job at storytelling, as most of the community would probably agree. I just really think they need to kind of work on the presentation for future stories. Alright, that's enough about the story, let's move on to the encounter design, which I'm definitely a lot more positive on as a whole. Now right off the bat I should say that I've actually not done very many of the raid wings in the game, I've maybe done 1 or 2. But the strikes I have plenty of experience with, as I do them daily or weekly as part of my rotation while I'm playing this game. Now generally I have a lot of fun doing these, but I do think there's something to be said about visual clutter being kind of an obstacle when you're doing these fights. As you probably noticed by now, Guild Wars 2 has this very distinct and unique art style, and I generally really find the art style pleasing to look at, especially when I'm out there in the world exploring Tyria. I feel like the problems arise, however, when there are 10 people descending on a strike boss and they're all putting out their own spell effects, they're placing puddles on the ground, they're dodging everywhere, there's numbers floating on the screen, there's everything happening all at once, and it can be really hard to see what's going on. Like, take a look at this for instance. Can you tell what is even happening here? This, coupled with mechanics from bosses that just one-shot you, can lead to a very frustrating experience in my opinion, where it just feels like sometimes you get one shot out of nowhere because you just can't tell what's happening due to the visual overload on the screen. I don't think this complaint is actually unique to Guild Wars 2 either. I feel like WoW has a lot of visual overload as well. I just think I've been a bit too spoiled by Final Fantasy XIV in this regard. So, this whole section has been pretty negative. With all that put out there on the table, do I actually even like Guild Wars 2? So I recently had over 700 hours of playtime in Guild Wars 2, and unlike other MMOs, I would say that this playtime is not as heavily concentrated around a single period of my life. Instead, they're spread out over smaller sessions from over 12 years, from when the game first released in 2012. Oh boy. And every time I return, I get insanely addicted to it all over again. Like, I play so much Guild Wars 2 for like a month or two. Then I leave, and then I return 6 to 8 months later, and the cycle repeats itself. Most recently I returned just in time to catch the end of the Halloween event, which I then proceeded to farm for countless hours on end. Shout out to all my lab boys out there. But why oh why do I keep returning to this game over and over again like I do? For the longest time I just really didn't get it. But now I think I finally narrowed it down to 2 things: the vibes and the world. Have you ever had that one game when you just come home after a long, tiring day? You just boot up this game and you go in that world and you just relax. Guild Wars 2 is that kind of game for me. And I think the one thing that just makes it so is the vibes. The vibes, man. Now, why are the vibes so good? I think it's a combination of several things. I think it's that beautiful, pleasing art style we talked about earlier. It's the player base, it's the way the game is designed, and of course, the music. While I was putting this video together, I actually watched an amazing video by another YouTuber called Angelica Tosh, where she talks about why the Azeroth from World of Warcraft Classic quote-unquote feels like home for so many people. In the video, which is amazing by the way, you should go watch it, she makes way too many good points to list here, but she zeroes in on the music in the starting zones as something that's really special, relaxing and soothing for the player. I think that's a really interesting observation, and I think that's definitely valid for Guild Wars 2 as well. But I feel like for Guild Wars 2 in particular, this sort of vibe kind of stretches out beyond the starting zones and stretches all the way across the entire game. I mean, just listen to this music from one of the new zones in Janthir Wilds. It's got this very Nordic feel to it, and being the stunning picture of a Nord myself, I of course cannot help but be swept away by this kind of music. With everything looking beautiful as well in the zone, it just makes for this really relaxing and immersive experience that can be really hard to remove yourself from, and it just makes you want to come back over and over again. The vibes actually carry over to the way the game is designed too. As you've probably gathered at this point, I really like raiding in Final Fantasy XIV especially, and part of that actually has to do with what you get out of it as well, which is the latest and greatest gear. As I said near the beginning of this video, I have this unhealthy relationship with getting the newest gear, getting the highest level, getting my number up there as far as humanly possible. But that's just not really the case for me in Guild Wars 2 at all. When you reach level 80, you'll want to grab some orange exotic gear, just so you can participate in all the endgame stuff, and that really isn't too difficult to get at all. And once you do get it, you have nothing to worry about in terms of gear anymore. Now it is possible to go for the pink colored Ascended gear, which is a small upgrade over the exotics, and that will take you quite a while if you want to go for the full set, but it really isn't necessary at all to participate in anything Guild Wars 2 has to offer. In fact, Ascended gear, or the stat selectable legendary gear, has been the end of Guild Wars 2 progression for 10 or so years now. That also means that if you finally get your Ascended gear and you burn yourself out on that grind maybe, you want to take a break and leave and you come back in like 6 months or 6 years or so even, that Ascended gear that you got back then is still just as viable as it was the day you left, because that's the way the developers want progression to be in Guild Wars 2. In other words, that FOMO, or fear of missing out, that you might feel from other MMOs where you feel like you have to log in every day or every week. So you can do your weekly or you can do your dailies to get the upgrade materials or a piece of gear, and if you don't get that, you can't join the latest raid or do the latest content because no groups will invite you if your gear level is too low. That stuff simply isn't in Guild Wars 2. At first I was like really confused by this, because what are you supposed to do if you're not constantly worried about your gear level or your item level? Like, why would I even play past this point? But slowly I started to realize that this lack of a gear grind or an item level grind is actually such a boon to this game, because it leaves you open to start focusing on every other aspect the game has to offer. You start setting goals for yourself that you can accomplish over time. And that's exactly what happens whenever I return to the game. I come back and then I start looking for something I haven't done yet, something I want to accomplish, such as learning and leveling a new class, gearing my ult for fractals, trying out a new type of build for a class, crafting a legendary weapon. And there's just no rush at all to do any of this stuff. It's just on my own time, on my own pace. It's weird, huh? Not feeling obligated to log into an MMO in 2024. It's something unique to Guild Wars 2 that you definitely have to adjust to, as odd as that sounds, but it's also the #1 reason I really like this game. When you couple all of this with the most reasonable and relaxed gaming community out there for an MMO, I feel like you've got yourself a winner in terms of vibes. The world of Guild Wars 2 is definitely an interesting one, and I think the most interesting thing about it is the way it asks the player to interact with it. This is where seasoned MMO veterans that haven't tried this game before have to kind of reconfigure their brains a bit, because in most MMOs you have to go out there, find a bunch of quests, usually around a town, then you go out into the world, complete all the quests, and then you come back and then you get a ton of XP. Now Guild Wars 2 does not do that. In fact, it just drops you on the map and is like, okay, now go explore. In Guild Wars 2 there really are no traditional quests outside of the main storyline. The closest thing you get is this heart icon that's on the map that you can go to, and you get some objectives to do and you fill a bar, but that's about it. Instead, you gain experience and levels by simply going around the world and exploring, filling in the map as you go and taking in the sights. And I think as someone who's looking for a more traditional RPG experience, or for someone who doesn't know this about Guild Wars 2, this can be very jarring. In fact, I myself was turned off by this back in 2012. I remember thinking the exploration got very samey while I was just trying to blast my way to level 80 as fast as possible with a friend, and so I never actually made it to endgame back then. Looking back, I can definitely see why it happened, and I think it has less to do with the way Guild Wars 2 is, and more to do with how my brain was hardwired by other MMOs back then. There's this old saying in the MMO landscape that the game gets good when you reach max level, and I definitely understand that sentiment. Like in WoW, for example, when you finally reach max level, you're doing less of the slow questing that some people might find very tedious, and you're doing more of the exciting endgame dungeons and raids and getting the coolest looking gear. As such, a goal for many players, including myself at the time, was getting to endgame as quickly as possible so I could finally start to quote unquote enjoy the game. And what I think happened was that I carried that sentiment over into Guild Wars 2 when I played it in 2012, completely blinding myself to this beautiful world that lay outside the XP bar at the bottom of the screen. And it is a beautiful world, and it's really one that deserves to be explored at a slower pace, not least so you can soak in, that's right, the vibes. And while there definitely is an endgame to Guild Wars 2, for instance there are fractal strikes and raids that you can't do while you're not level 80, the core of the game remains the same, and the focus of the game is always on this exploration. Each expansion or major patch brings even more maps to the game, and these maps are always filled with different activities to do, secrets to find, or world bosses to slay with dozens if not hundreds of other players. In fact, the so-called meta events are so impressive that they really deserve their own section, but this video is getting up there in length, so I think I'll keep it short for now. So all I'll say here is that they're really impressive, and they're one of the standout features of Guild Wars 2, even if the amount of players and effects and things happening on the screen can demolish the frame rates of any good gaming PC out there. Anyway, if you couldn't tell by now, I just find Tyria a really nice place to hang out in, and it's absolutely beautiful to explore. And if you're interested in crafting the legendaries of this game, exploring is something you will absolutely have to do, as completing the maps 100% actually earns you some materials that you need for the crafting process. Thankfully, this is not as tedious as it sounds, because exploring is one of my favorite things to do in this game. Whenever a new map is released and the story finally lets me off the hook from all the talking and just lets me explore the map, I go out there and I explore absolutely everything the map has to offer before ever touching the story again. And I'm not rushing to do so at all. I'm just taking it all in and just enjoying my time in this world. I'm praying that when ArenaNet finally decides to grace the world with Guild Wars 3, I hope that they don't forget about this aspect of their game design, because it is absolutely one of the most unique and standout features of Guild Wars 2. It's really something that sets Guild Wars 2 apart from every other MMO out there right now. Listen, there's just so much more about this game that I could tell you that just absolutely slaps. I've mostly been talking about the PvE content in this video, but there's also this whole PvP side to the game with more standard PvP matches, and this huge world versus world PvP where servers go up against each other. But my main point, and what I really want you to take away from this video, is that if you've never played Guild Wars 2 and you found anything that I talked about here to sound exciting or interesting in any way, I feel like you owe it to yourself to try out the game. It's very easy to try out too, with the entirety of the core game from level 1 to level 80 being completely free to play now. If you don't really vibe with the story while you're leveling, I don't really blame you, because I sure didn't either, but I will tell you that the story actually does get miles better as soon as you hit an expansion. I know that technically isn't free, but just so you know, there is an enjoyable stride of storytelling coming as soon as you start Heart of Thorns, in my opinion. But luckily, while you're leveling, there's still all these other aspects that we talked about to enjoy and make you fall in love with this game, just like I did. And if you're a WoW, Final Fantasy XIV, or any other MMO refugee coming to Guild Wars 2, just try to remember to slow things down and enjoy your time in the world. It takes time to adjust to the charms of Guild Wars 2, but once you do, I feel like you'll start to understand why this is one of the most unique, relaxing, and fun MMORPGs out there today. Hallo. So this video took a long time to make, much longer than I anticipated when I started to write the script. But it was a blast to make, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know what you have to do. Please remember to like and subscribe.